Thank you very much, Dr. Lundberg. It is indeed an honor. So, as a quick background for myself, Medicinc has both managed medical groups for 27 or 28 years. In many instances, the medical groups we manage continue to be very dedicated to new ways of providing care and managing outcomes. And we've also spent a tremendous amount of time and energy and money innovating new ways for doctors to provide better care. So just at the start, this is a huge topic. I'm very aware that there are both lay people and highly trained medical scientists or practitioners. Let's start with the reality that medicine really, for our purposes tonight, has two faces. Part of it is a science that, by its definition and nature, wants to discover more about the human body, human health, etc. And science always enjoys or appreciates new tools that make advancement possible. There is also the practice of medicine, and although it is science-based, in fact, if you look closely, a lot of medical practice has been taught to doctors sort of as a craft or explained as an art. And in some ways, this was very adaptive because medicine is very, very complicated. For a very long time, until very recently, we didn't have computers that could help out. So we relied on the judgment of individuals who could put all this together in their minds and come up with the best possible solution. One of my theses tonight is that medical practice today is presently overwhelmed by the complexity of medical science. And in fact, often enough, patients do not get care which the science is ready to give them. And we're going to explore that, not with an idea towards blaming anybody, but with an idea towards explaining and understanding how that came to be. So this is not largely, we're going to talk about AI, but this is not your deep dive into AI. There's a lot of different kinds. George mentioned some of them. They've now sort of graded it to, powerful, very, very powerful, and extremely powerful. It's incredibly helpful when you get to very large data sets, and it's probably going to be capable of finding patterns and things which in complex data sets that are not visible to the human eye or mind. For what we're going to do tonight, though, is talk about a specific kind of AI, which is a more powerful kind of decision support. So very quickly, keeping in mind that we have lay people and highly trained, I'm going to trace the history of medicine in 2 minutes. So the taxonomy I like is, at any given moment, what do we understand about the human body and human health? What do we understand about what can go wrong, cause disease, etc.? And what is medicine capable of fixing, repairing, managing, or in some other way ameliorating some or all of the disease processes? So we've been at this a long time. 2,500 years before the Common Era, the Egyptian mummification process demonstrated a pretty sophisticated understanding of anatomy and physiology. Humans, probably before language, have always understood injury and trauma and aging. And there were various kinds of medicinal and surgical practices that go way, way back. Some of them, it turns out, were helpful and some not. There's perseverant interest for a long time in bleeding people, and that didn't seem to help very much, but other things that they did. So then 3 sort of very important things happened. One was the invention of the microscope, and the second are all the subsequent kinds of analytic, imaging, etc. capabilities. And that development then was expanded in less than 200 years ago with the creation or the recognition of inorganic chemistry. Our bodies are organic chemistry. Our bodies are pretty much factories. So we began to understand deeper and deeper into the kinds of tissues and substances things like hormones, the immune system. We came to be aware of the environment. We separated out pathogens into things like bacteria and fungi and viruses, et cetera, that we understood now that not only is there an immune system, but occasionally it goes bonkers and causes other medical problems. One of the greatest things that happened in the entire history of medicine was the development based on understanding pathogens of the importance of hygiene. Obviously, surgical and interventional care. And we went from finding natural substances that had a beneficial molecule to synthesizing them and now to designing them. And at this point, we're at the foyer or the threshold of a new era. And that era sort of was launched when Watson and Crick explained and demonstrated the genome. 50 years later, after a huge international effort, multi-part effort, well-funded, it was announced that the genome had been sequenced. It turned out that, well, maybe not quite, so it was about 92% complete. And at that time, the genome that they hadn't worked with a single person. They took different parts of the genome from different people. So last year, it was announced in Science that now they can sequence the entire genome. And this year, and I don't believe it's happened yet, they're supposed to publish the first ever end-to-end human genome from a single person. They say that's in 2023, so that gives them a couple months to get there. The lucky candidate is a Dr. Leon Peshkin from Harvard. And when that is done, if you chose to print it, it would be 1 million pages. Big, big pile of data. So once the genome has kind of come into fashion, it changes everything because humans have a genome, cancers have a genome, bacteria have a genome. There's genomic interventions like CRISPR and customizing the human immune system response. This is far beyond my capability, but it allows the possibility for us to see a lot more of what goes on. And throughout this history, what's really happened is that it's like one of those series of Russian eggs. Every time they discovered something, they would open it up, and inside there'd be more, and then they'd open that up, and it's gone and on and on and on. And we certainly know a lot more now than what we used to. So there are all sorts of ways that AI is going to advance the discovery and the explanation of the science of medicine. And in many cases, science couldn't advance until or unless they had ways to deal, for example, with all this genomic information. It's just beyond the human mind to kind of wrap around that. That is not my topic tonight. That's the genome part. I'm very interested, my teammates and I, in asking the question, so of all the stuff we know at any given moment about the body, about disease, about medicine, how much of that makes it to the patient? Because that's a pretty big, important question. And whether it's one doctor in this case, or a team of doctors who may or may not communicate given our financial system and the way we set up healthcare, it's very important that we make whatever is available and solidly available to the patient. So why? This is an article from the last couple of months from the British Medical Journal, and it's upsetting and basically concludes that right around 800,000 Americans either become permanently disabled or die because dangerous diseases are misdiagnosed. That's a big number, and it's regrettable. So what they're saying, in essence, if you think about the flow of clinical practice, doctors and their teams and others gather information from the patient and from examination and from diagnostic tests. They make a diagnosis. Based on that, they offer therapies and or treatments, and they're supposed to circle back and figure out, does it work? What they're saying is that those two middle are not working for 800,000 people to the level that those people are seriously hurt or dead. And if you were to break this out, about 3/4 of those 800,000 have their problem due to infection, to a vascular illness, or cancer, with about 25% being spread among all other and smaller causes added up. So now let's go to primary care. What does, in the end, primary care do? There are basically 3 missions that primary care doctors and their team, nurse practitioners and others, do. The first is they take care of acute illness or issues. If something hurts, unless you're critically ill or damaged in some way, you're very likely to go to a primary care doctor who will sort this out, may treat it or diagnose and treat it, or may send you on to somebody else, depending on the nature of what they think is going on. The second kind of work is the providing of to patients of wellness and prevention. So wellness are things like checking to make sure that you don't have cancer, or that if you do, we're going to catch it early. Prevention would be things like vaccines. Pediatricians are much better at this than adult doctors are. It's practically a sacrament for them. And the third, and this is a place where pediatric medicine and adult primary care kind of verge a little bit. So in adult primary care, the doctors take care of the majority of chronic diseases. We're going to get into that at some level. And in fact, 90% of Medicare's money and 75% of the total US spend is spent on patients with chronic diseases. Makes sense. So when we began our work 20 years ago, we said, this is probably a pretty important place for us to focus. Obviously, we want to take care of the acute needs of patients, which may be trivial or significant. We want to do wellness, but chronic disease has a lot to do with whether people live longer and healthily or not. So as I said a moment ago, 86% this year, the total spend for healthcare in America will be $4.7 trillion, and 86% of that is going to go to chronic disease. And 6 in 10 people adults have a chronic disease, with 4 in 10 having 2 or more chronic diseases. So it's a big number. It affects a lot of people. This is a list of the most common, if you're a primary care adult medicine doctor, this is a list of what you see day in and day out: hypertension, diabetes, cholesterol, heart disease, etc. And what we know, it's very clear and well established, is that when such diseases are poorly controlled, they already have happened. There's not most instances you can't get rid of them. There may be exceptions. By definition, the patient is not as safe, and the quality of care is lower. And the patient isn't as safe because in the population, you're much more likely to have heart attacks and strokes and amputations, go to the hospital, the emergency room, have to have all kinds of cardiac procedures, etc. Conversely, if a patient has, for example, blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol, and that disease is well controlled, then by definition the patient is safer, because in fact there are fewer of those, the quality is higher, and by the way, all of those unwanted artifacts at the bottom there are very expensive. They're expensive to the patient because they intrude on his or her life and interrupt happy functioning, may foreshorten death, etc. And they're expensive to the system. All those things start at about $100,000 and go up from there. So this is a happy place where better quality actually is less expensive, and we're going to show that. So that's the cost of poor quality and the benefit of control. So let's just look at a couple of the most common diseases. First off, blood pressure. So there's 135 million Americans with blood pressure. About 70% of all people will eventually get it in their lives. And there is a proposed blood pressure level of 140/90. For those who don't know, the top number, the systolic pressure, is the pressure in your arteries at the moment that your heart contracts. And the second number is when your heart's at rest, the diastolic. So the standard advice is that we should have blood pressure below 140/90, with minor exceptions here or there. But there's a tremendous body of evidence that say maybe it ought really to be 130/80. Well, there's been a slow move to advance this because the theory, I think, there's some medical questions, to be fair. But if you just got a 44 on the test, why would you ask the professor to make the next one harder? So there's some belief among people that we don't propose the 130/80 because we do so badly in the first place. We do even worse if the test was harder. I'm going to talk a little bit about cholesterol later, but it's just basically we're not delivering the care that is necessary. Type 2 diabetes, about 75% do not get there's a famous triple goal that your blood pressure, your blood sugar level, and your cholesterol should be in tight. That's not happening. And then in heart failure, and I don't have time tonight, but there's an astonishing 1.1 success rate in getting patients with HFrEF, which is heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, on the right medications and the right doses in a major study called the CHAMP study in 2018. We, in our group, when this came out, were so shocked. We had all of our heart failure patients were sent for heart failure care to one of the two 50-plus doctor cardiology groups that were owned by the two big hospital systems in Dayton, and we did not find a single patient that was properly treated. Now, you could argue that 0 is not a whole lot less than 1. So, in recent time, there has been some pressure to do better. And when confronted with the data, the standard response in most medical groups at the start is to blame the patients. They're non-adherent and non-compliant. They don't do what we tell them to do, and therefore it's their fault. Leave me alone. A second round of intervention, which was tried in other industries many, many, many years ago, like 45 years ago, and didn't work, was to get an analytic software that combs through all of the electronic health record data, and some perhaps claims and others, and sorts out and creates a list of all the patients who did not have good outcomes. Patients whose blood pressure is too high, whose blood sugar is too high, cholesterol, whatever. People who go to the emergency room pretty often, all kinds of things. And these are called gaps in care. The leader of one large medical group bought one of these software analytic programs and mentioned to me that they had run the program and they had 240,000 patients whose blood pressure was too high, and this was quite a big problem. One of the reasons why this is not a good way to go at, it's good to know your score, that's not the point, is that you don't want to do quality work retrospectively. Everybody learned in quality theory and practice, you want to do it on a going forward, don't make the mistake so the patient's not on the list next time they come in. And we'll get into that in a moment. So those examples suggest that in some instances, there's some kind of a rupture in that flow from what we know to what gets done. And we've been very interested for a very long time in asking the simple question, why? Why is it such that, I mean, doctors are very smart people. We didn't all set out to do basically a bad job. So what's going on? So one way of thinking about this is a complexity problem. Let's take a woman who's 55 years old and she gets cancer. So that woman has a unique genome, genes that may bear or not on her cancer susceptibility or whatever. She also has a socioeconomic status. Let's say in this case she's poor, and that has all kinds of implications on how much stress she's lived under, and that has implications likely on her health status in terms of what kind of care she's been able to get and all of that. And let's say that because she's poor, she lives in a portion of her state which is called Cancer Alley because there's so much carcinogen in the air, water, whatever. And by the way, she has an immune competence. It could be a good, or it could have been compromised. There's a lot of different values in each of these. So now she gets cancer. Her cancer, we used to think about cancers in terms of where the point of origin was. And now we think about it, increasingly, they think about them in terms of sequencing the cancer genome and understanding what is this cancer doing. And by the way, she has comorbid conditions, and at some point they're going to tune this up for some kind of intervention. There may be a possibility in the future that we could grab hold of or use her immune competence to, in conjunction with some kind of genetic editing, to attack this cancer. And it may be that she will take some other chemo or other therapy. And by the way, when you do want to give any drug, you have to realize that that drug's your body's ability to metabolize that drug may have genetic factors that make it more or less able to do that. So what you're talking about here is, because every one of these has a lot of variables, is a complexity. So simple is when A leads to B. Complex is when, first off, you have a lot of variables. The more variables, the more complex. In those variables, there are values for each variable. And so the value for a single variable may significantly influence or affect the overall equation and how this comes out. There are combinations of variables. We know that in certain diseases, gene A causes a problem, but in most of those instances, it's increasingly obvious that there are clusters of genes that work together to dispose or prohibit the advancement of disease. So when you have all of this, you then start to generate more and more permutations. And not every permutation is necessarily going to be the cause of a different or a form of treatment. But in fact, there is a multiplier effect through all this, and this interaction, so if A might not matter, but A together with B might matter a lot, but A together with C might matter a little, it goes on and on and on and on. And that is the state of medicine today. And as much as it is today, it's going to be more so in another 3, 5, 7, 10, 15 years. Because we're developing and producing more on the science side to explain all of this. So let's go back. Primary care doctors, by far the most common of all the chronic diseases is hypertension. And I will ask primary care doctors, is hypertension simple? And they'll say, oh yeah, hypertension is simple. Well, going back to 1999, the CDC says this is the percent of diagnosed hypertension patients who have gotten their blood pressure below 140/90. It peaked at around 54%. Most people believe that today it's considerably below 43 after the pandemic. So if that's easy, what would be hard? Here in California, there is an Office of the Patient Advocate, and if you have either a master's degree in information services or a 14-year-old, you can get online and you can find out every medical group in the state's blood pressure control rate for patients 65 and under. So they cut out the really tough cases, which are 65 to 85, but it's something. So we're in San Francisco, and here in San Francisco, Kaiser has a 73% success rate, Hill Physicians a 55%, Brown and Tolan 35, and the Chinese Community Healthcare Association 23. Quite a lot of diversity. By the way, around the state, Kaiser is often first in its market. And they have had and continued a major push to do better. They used to do even better, and that's fallen off. In some of the counties, they're not as good. Just because I wanted to be equal, I picked a Southern California county, Ventura. Once again, Kaiser is at 74, UCLA is at 62, a couple at 39, 38, and one at 24. By the way, a lot of these medical organizations are IPAs, so the small practices practice under Hill or Brown and Tolan or Valley Care or whatever. So once again, this does not support the theory that this is easy. I had my assistant, who really did not like doing this, write down every single medical group in every county and their score. And this is a distribution. On the x-axis across the bottom is the percent of their hypertension patients who are at goal. So there are 25 medical groups that have a 17% success rate and 3 that have an 80% success rate. It's hard to believe that the patients in California, although there may be a socioeconomic factor here, are that different. So it's probably the way the medicine is delivered. By the way, there is a study that was done at the University of California in the South, I think, I'm not sure which one, basically found that we have $500 billion a year in costs to the system from doctors and nurse practitioners writing the wrong medicines when they treat chronic disease patients. So we came up 20 years ago with the theory that maybe we should help our doctors get the right medicines, because it clearly isn't that easy. And we began this work on paper and pencil tools with all kinds of analysis and da-da-da. And you're seeing the work 20 years later. It wasn't always pretty. There's a little thing I want to talk a little bit about for 1 minute related to how, on TV, medical science says this works. It's a little different than that. So let's suppose you have medical condition A and you have a therapeutic agent. The FDA is going to require that you have to get it tested and proven one way or another. So somebody creates a study. There's a design with an intervention. There are patients that can be included in the study and can't be included. There are measures that are proposed, and there are comparators. This is the way studies go. If you're treating a problem and it's a simple A to B solution, one of these studies probably pretty helpful in guiding your medical practice. By the way, after it's all done, the outcome is inevitably going to be distributed or be produced as a distribution. It doesn't say yes or no. It says so many people did what something. But what happens if there are 5,000 studies? Or in blood pressure, more than 50,000. And it's way more. I don't know how many there are, but let's just say over the years, hundreds of thousands. So imagine you're a doctor sitting in a room with a patient. You've got 15 minutes, and you got to think, okay, all these studies, who was included, who was excluded, who did better, who did worse, what was the distribution? It's not going to happen. It's a complexity problem that is clearly beyond the capabilities of human cognition, even if you're a doctor. And by the way, there are 1.8 million studies published each year in 80,000 medical journals. So the idea that you're keeping up with the literature, and we can go back, there are people younger than Dr. Lundberg who practiced when there were 2 or 3 drugs for blood pressure, and either they worked or they didn't. It was pretty simple. Sadly, often it didn't, but it did sometimes. So let's take what we did. We discovered 13 classes of drugs. Each of these classes may have many constituent drugs. Some of them have differences between the drugs in the class, some don't. Most doctors, for those who are listening or participating online and who are running a medical group, it's not that hard to go into your EHR and test how many drugs or types of drugs, classes of drugs, does your group tend to write, or does Dr. A or B or C or D tend to write? Most of them write between 3 and 6 classes of drugs. And that's because it's pretty complicated. By the way, hypertension often takes a couple, 3 drugs to get you in good control. One of the things we learned a long time ago was to try to figure out how to talk about all disease processes in a manner that an average person, and by average I mean average, can understand. So for blood pressure, we encourage our doctors and NPs and others to say, look, you have a pump, which is your heart. You have pipes, which are your arteries. They're filled with blood, which is a fluid. It's a closed system. It pushes oxygen and nutrients all the way from your brain to your toenails. And inside that system, there's a lot of pressure that's built up, and it's not good for your heart. You're wearing it out, and it's not good for the pipes, because if one of them breaks, particularly in your head, you're not going to like that. And everybody, by the way, has a relative or friend or whatever who had a stroke. Nobody wants that. So we tell our patients, we did a study on you. And so all of your arteries, everybody's arteries, have a thin muscle sheath around them. And due to inactivity, age, or genes, that can cramp down and literally make the artery smaller. It's called vasoconstriction. Obviously, the pump pushing into a smaller space pushes the pressure up. But you could have problems with your heart. It could be pumping either too hard or too fast or both. And in some instances, you could have too much fluid in the system. And in many instances, and this is not well understood, you can have a combination, so it could be 50% arteries, 50% heart, on and on and on. Good to know that. We discovered that for $30 in an in-office test, we could sort that out, which meant that our group, most other groups don't do this, our group is not guessing. And the odds, it turns out, when you guess, aren't very good. And by the way, once you've figured out what I just went through is called the hemodynamics, where's the pressure coming from in the system, all of you just understood that. None of you are cardiologists. Frankly, you could have a 6th grade education and understand it. Then you would have to say, well, it's very helpful to know, is this patient over or under 60 for all sorts of research reasons? Is the patient African American? And that is a long story that I can't get into, but it changes the way you might treat. And what other either cardiovascular comorbid, what other heart disease-related diseases or vascular-related diseases do you have? And what other non-cardiovascular diseases do you have? Because any one of these 28 variables could change the medications that you might prefer to use, or you can't use, or you need to be cautious when you use. So if you think about this, then there are around 200 million permutations. And as I said earlier, not every permutation means a difference in therapy, but a lot of them do. Not too many people, however smart they are and whatever medical school they went to, are going to be strong enough to go through that. Begins to explain why do we have 43, 54, 72, whatever, UCLA is 62% success. So part of it is to get the patient to agree to take their medicine. And a very big part is, can we help the doctor write the correct medicine? So we created originally paper tools, and then our AI solution is attached. Doctor and patient are in the room. We really love it when they share a screen and talk about what's on the screen together. Not all doctors are willing or able to do that. They hit a button in their EHR, and all that patient's data goes up to our cloud AI technology in about a second. Happily for us, the government has required all EHRs to have a plug set called FHIR and Smart on FHIR that allows us to connect to them relatively quickly and easily. It's well known that PharmDs, experts in pharmacology, can often add value. We couldn't afford to put them in all the offices, so we decided to put them in the technology. And in another second, this spins out and says, here are the drug recommendations in the order that we would use them, and in many instances, down to the milligram. That's what God invented computers to do, and not necessarily what people can do when you get to these large data sets. And this, by the way, is our screen that explains to the patient. In this case, we learned, by the way, patients hate red lines. So the story here is your arteries are too tight and your heart is going too fast and you're wearing both of them out. We're going to give you medicine that's going to slow your heart down and open your arteries up. And if you give that little bit of explanation, it is astonishing how many patients will take their medicine. If I tell them that their blood pressure is 165/93, what does that mean? 165 might be the bowling score they've always wanted to get to. So it turns out it works. We introduced this technology in our medical group and then subsequently in others. This, to our knowledge, is the best hypertension outcome in the nation. Remarkable in part, you can see the difference between the national average at 44% to this. We're double. And that means, I'll show you in a minute, more patients living longer, healthier, not having a heart attack, not having a stroke, saving money from the system. More astonishing is that one of our offices, embedded in this are all of our diagnosed hypertension, one of our offices is staffed by some African American doctors who preferentially wanted to serve an underserved community and who are very focused on the heart health and blood pressure health and diabetes health of their patients. So this is their subset population baked into the number above. You can see that they took a bigger hit in the pandemic, not a surprise. But this population is in socioeconomically challenged zip codes, and a lot of them are Medicare, Medicaid, or uninsured, the majority. And if you look at where they got to after the pandemic, 21, 22, whatever, I will just tell you that there's another small medical group that's rather known or well known for its heart care in Ohio, called a little outfit called the Cleveland Clinic. Their blood pressure control rate across at 140 is about 70%. So our inner city African American poor people are 20% better than their suburban people in Cleveland, which I feel, and I think all our doctors feel, very good about. So there are all kinds of outcomes that you can measure in terms of better than the national average, better than the average bear. Costs are lower, $198 savings per person per month. Among diabetes, we have fewer inpatient costs, fewer admissions, fewer high-cost patients. This is good for people and good for a system. So I'm going to talk very, very quickly about cholesterol. Dr. Lundberg didn't want me to, but because it's somewhat controversial, but quickly. In 2013, there was the American College of Cardiology, American Heart, and all of these other entities publish a recommendation, and it was very simple. If a patient came in, they either needed just to watch their diet and exercise, or they needed a medium-sized statin, if they could tolerate it, or they needed a big statin. So none, medium, large. That was everybody. It was highly controversial because lipidologists, cardiologists, endocrinologists, they were constantly saying, we're under-recognizing this disease, et cetera. So they put together a much larger thing, American Heart, American College of Cardiology, all of those letters are big, American Diabetes Association, and go on and on and on. And they came up with a new standard in 2018. And in the new standard, every individual has his or her own cholesterol LDL goal based on 82 different variables, and there are a wide variety of recommendations. Sadly, they're not used. And the reason they're not used is that they're too complicated for anybody to remember. It'd take you 45 minutes to go find all the data, etc. And so each doctor, you come in and say, I'm at 120 on my LDL and you're at 90, works for me, doesn't work for me. Got 500,000 people doing whatever they do. This, by the way, is the first 3 pages of a 17-page summarized decision tree. And so you're missing the last 14 pages, but it gets really good towards the end. When we did this, what we discovered is, and we were better than the average group anyway, that somewhere between 45 and 50% of our patients were being undertreated as compared to the new standard. So in a minute here, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction and talk about healthcare delivery in comparison. George mentioned that I represent a business perspective. I'm also pretty highly trained in quality science. And so it turns out lots of businesses have a lot of complexity. And most of them handle their complexity better than we do. So let's go back to 1945. The war is over. GIs are returning. Some go to school. Some go back to their family right away. They're anxious. They want washing machines and dryers and furnishings and cars and all that. And the people who ran the American car industry said, what we're really going to focus on is driving down our manufacturing costs to the lowest possible level, often by speeding things up, and we'll attract new customers by style. It was called in the business throwing chrome. Fins, remember that was the day when they did all that stuff. They did not focus on quality, and they did not focus on fuel efficiency, and in fact, large bore engines were all the rage, and they used more fuel. After this, in the same time frame, the Japanese industrial base was devastated, and they had no position in the world economy. So they decided to adopt an American PhD in statistics who taught them that everything was about quality. And that to build a perfect car, a perfect TV set, a perfect washing machine, or whatever, you had to start and make perfect screws. And then you had to make perfect fasteners. And then you had to make perfect carburetors and transmissions all the way up. And this pursuit of perfection went on and on and on. As it happened, Japan also didn't have any oil reserves, so they focused on saving or having great mileage. And they did not really focus for the first many years on style. A Camry for many years was not ugly, but it wasn't really that great. So in 1976, American cars represented 87% of cars bought in the US, and the Japanese represented 7%. In 73, of course, we had the auto embargo. US cars were really bad at that point. Ford was called Fix or Repair Daily. General Motors was called General Maintenance. And people bought the Japanese cars, particularly out here in California, where people do things differently, much more than in the Midwest, because they were fuel, and they discovered they were better made. And over the next, starting in about 1980, wherever in the world you were, and you wanted to make something for sale, you had to become obsessed with quality. The American car companies took a long time to figure this out, and they were 30 years or 40 years behind the Japanese. But eventually they did. Along the way, they almost went bankrupt except for a government bailout. And by the way, today, the American car business sells 43% of the cars. Back in the earlier 1976, GM was 47%. Today, it's 14%. All of this, that pursuit of perfection, involves enormous amounts of complexity and solving for that complexity. So you would say, well, that's car manufacturing. It has nothing whatsoever to do with health. And maybe that I'll grant the position, I don't agree with it. Complexity is complexity. There may be different kinds in different businesses, okay, but it's still complexity. So let's then go to a service business, because that's really what healthcare is. And I picked the airlines for a whole lot of reasons I can't explain. So what do the airlines do? The airlines make a very simple promise to which they are totally committed. And that is, they're going to get you from point A to point B alive. Their focus is safety, 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 safety. And if they didn't have that focus, what they don't focus, or at least the focus, the promise, or what they don't promise, or at least it varies by brand, are things like comfort and whether there'll be more than 2 pretzels in your bag or whatever, if they even have them, etc. Well, they too have enormous amounts of complexity. They have very complicated airplanes with tons of technology. They have mechanical issues sometimes, but rarely. Their weather, people bring laptops that burst in flames. There's just all kinds of stuff. And part of their issue is that we fly about 16.5 million commercial flights in the US every year, which is 45,000 a day. And as we're talking here, there are 5,400 planes in the air. So just the scale introduces an enormous complexity. By the way, there's 125 different US commercial pilots, not counting hobbyists and the like. And they don't want people to go in there and do the art of flying. They want people to go in and do the science of flying because they know what will work best. So there have been 2 US air fatalities in the last 12 years, and the last major crash was in 22 years ago. So what this kind of says to us is that quality science, because that's what all this is, the management of complexity is quality science. And there are, attendant to that, a whole variety of tools, and that's where quality can happen. And we, in the healthcare side, especially on the delivery, don't very often use sophisticated quality science or tools. The suppliers, the people who make the drugs, the people who run the labs, the people who make the surgical supplies and equipment, they do. But the practitioners, not so much. And virtually all manufacturing and service businesses today that are successful do this kind of very advanced commitment to safety and or quality, however that is defined. So the point, and they do it not necessarily, although there may be some dedication to their customers, but they do it because in 2023, you can't really sell a bad car. In other words, if you're a manufacturer and you produce a lot of bad cars, the word will get around. Pretty nearly everything that people sell today, either hard goods, manufactured goods, or services, pretty nearly all of it is in fact visible to the public, but not medicine. You could not figure out who has good blood pressure outcomes, good diabetes outcomes, good cholesterol outcomes, or even sometimes good CABG outcomes, heart surgery outcomes, in a given market. And that's impeding the quest towards future development. So at the end of the day, we're going to go to questions and answers here in just a moment. The question that medicine and medical delivery has to ask itself is, are we going to step up? The combination of quality and AI as an enabler of that quality is what is necessary in order to go to the next level, because there's no way that our 500,000 or so primary care practitioners can get all this in hand by a few extra lunch and learns or the like.
On the other hand, that's where it is. Bob Matthews at Medisync.com. If you want to know more about this, or you want your healthcare system to start succeeding at a higher clip than it now does. Join me in thanking our speaker. We appreciate your efforts. Thank you.